German border officer vanished in 1942. 83 years later, his mountain checkpoint was discovered. August 17, 2024. The Italian Alps, 2,847 meters above sea level. A team of climate researchers from the University of Innsbruck trudges through receding ice near the Ortler mountain range, documenting the accelerating retreat of alpine glaciers. Dr. Elena Marchetti stops mid-stride. Her boot has struck something metallic beneath the thinning ice sheet. What she assumes is abandoned climbing equipment reveals itself as something far more sinister. The rusted barrel of a Karabiner 98K rifle, still loaded, protruding from ice that hasn't melted in over 8 decades. Within 3 hours, the research team has contacted the Carabinieri and the South Tyrol Archaeological Office. By nightfall on August 18th, excavation equipment is being helicoptered to the remote site. What emerges over the next 72 hours rewrites a chapter of World War II history that historians believed closed in 1942. The structure is a forgotten border checkpoint, designated in Wehrmacht documents as Grenzposten Alpha 7. The facility consists of a reinforced concrete bunker measuring 8.2 meters by 4.6 meters, built directly into the mountain face. The entrance, sealed by a steel door bearing the Reichsadler eagle emblem and the marking Grenzpolizei, 1940, remains frozen shut until thermal equipment can be deployed. Inside, the temperature hovers at -4 degrees Celsius, creating a perfect preservation chamber for everything within. When investigators finally breach the entrance on August 21, 2024, they discover a scene frozen in time. The interior contains a functioning radio transmitter, detailed topographical maps covering routes from Germany through Italy to Switzerland, a metal filing cabinet with personnel records still legible, and most remarkably, a leather satchel containing identity documents, personal letters, and a handwritten journal spanning from January 1942 to March 1942. The documents belong to Hauptmann Klaus Hermann Steiner, born April 3, 1907, in Munich, Bavaria. According to German military records declassified in 1975, Hauptmann Steiner died in combat on the Eastern Front near Argev, Russia, on March 19, 1942. His death certificate, filed with the Wehrmacht Casualty Office, Wehrmachtsauskunftsstelle, under reference number WAST 42M 17749, lists cause of death as killed in action during artillery bombardment. His name appears on the memorial at the German War Cemetery in Rossachka, Volgograd Oblast, among 47,000 other fallen soldiers. But the journal found in the mountain checkpoint tells a different story. The final entry, dated March 14, 1942, reads in precise German script, "The last pieces are in place. Tomorrow I become someone else. May God forgive what I must do to survive and what I must leave behind." Forensic analysis conducted by the Bundeskriminalamt, German Federal Criminal Police, in September 2024 confirms the handwriting matches authenticated samples from Steiner's military service records. More damning still, fingerprints lifted from the journal and metal surfaces inside the checkpoint match partial prints on file from Steiner's 1935 Police Academy graduation certificate. DNA extracted from hair samples found in a uniform cap inside the bunker shows a familial match to Steiner's granddaughter, now 61 years old and living in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a woman who believed her grandfather died heroically in Russia before she was born. The official record says Klaus Steiner died in March 1942. The evidence says he vanished from his post on the Italian-Swiss border, staged his own death, and disappeared into a network that would keep him hidden for decades. If you want to see what investigators found inside that frozen checkpoint, how a decorated German officer erased himself from history, and where he spent the next 40 years of his life under a name that no one suspected, hit the like button and subscribe. because this story goes deeper than anyone imagined. Klaus Hermann Steiner was born into a middle-class Munich family on April 3, 1907, the eldest of three sons to Hermann Steiner, a railway administrator, and Margarethe Steiner, née Vogel, a schoolteacher. Growing up in Weimar-era Germany, Klaus demonstrated exceptional aptitude for languages, mastering Italian and French by age 16 alongside his native German. His academic records from the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, where he studied from 1925 to 1929, show a focus on geography and European border law subjects that would later prove instrumental in his survival. In 1929, facing limited prospects during Germany's economic collapse, Steiner joined the Bavarian State Police, Bayerische Landespolizei, at age 22. His personnel file, preserved in the Bavarian State Archives, describes him as meticulous, disciplined, possessing superior map reading and navigation skills. By 1932, he had risen to the rank of Kriminalassistent, working primarily in border security and customs enforcement along Bavaria's southern frontier with Austria. The political upheaval of 1933 transformed German law enforcement. When the Nazis consolidated power, police forces were reorganized under Heinrich Himmler's expanding security apparatus. Steiner, like many career policemen, faced a choice: join the Nazi Party and continue his career, or resign and face unemployment during the Depression. On May 1, 1933, he became party member number 2,897,453, a reluctant pragmatist rather than an ideological zealot, according to post-war testimony from colleagues. His life took a decisive turn in 1934 when he married Anna Elisabeth Müller, a 26-year-old librarian from Rosenheim. Their wedding photograph, discovered among the checkpoint documents, shows a lean, dark-haired man with penetrating eyes standing beside a woman with gentle features and an uncertain smile. They had two children, daughter Helene, born March 1935, and son Friedrich, born November 1936. Steiner's expertise in border security and mountain terrain brought him to the attention of the Grenzpolizei, border police, a specialized branch responsible for Germany's frontiers. In 1937, he was transferred to the newly established Alpine Border Command, headquartered in Bolzano, in what was then the Italian South Tyrol region. His promotion to Hauptmann, captain, came in January 1940, placing him in command of border checkpoints along the strategically vital German-Italian frontier. His assignment was Grenzposten Alpha 7, a high-altitude observation post monitoring smuggling routes and refugee movements through the Ortler Massif. The posting was considered both prestigious and grueling. Only the most experienced mountain officers could endure the isolation, severe weather, and physical demands of alpine border duty. Steiner supervised a rotating detail of 8 to 12 men, maintaining communication with command posts in Merano and Innsbruck via radio and weekly courier runs. Colleagues described Steiner as fanatically organized and obsessed with contingencies. He maintained detailed logs of weather patterns, crossing routes, smuggler activity, and personnel movements. He drilled his men in emergency protocols and survival techniques. Captain Franz Weber, who served under Steiner from June to September 1940, later told Allied interrogators in 1946, "Steiner knew every cave, every pass, every shepherd's hut within 50 kilometers. He studied maps the way priests study scripture. We thought he was paranoid. He was preparing." What Steiner was preparing for became clear as the war's trajectory shifted. In December 1941, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, which had begun with stunning victories in June, ground to a halt before Moscow. Casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, consuming entire divisions. Officers like Steiner, particularly those with administrative rather than combat postings, faced increasing pressure for frontline reassignment. On January 8, 1942, Steiner received transfer orders. He was to report to the Sixth Army, then besieging Stalingrad, by February 15th. His Alpine Border Command would be dissolved, folded into Wehrmacht military police units. For a 34-year-old officer with a wife and 2 young children, assignment to the Eastern Front was effectively a death sentence. Survival rates for German officers in the Soviet Union during winter 1940-142 ran below 40%. The transfer orders arrived alongside devastating personal news. On January 3, 1942, British RAF bombers struck Munich in a nighttime raid. A bomb hit the apartment building on a license trace where Anna and the children lived while Steiner served in the mountains. Anna, age 34, died instantly. Helene, age 6, and Friedrich, age 5, were killed in the subsequent fire. The Munich Civil Registry, document number M1942B00347, records all 3 deaths as occurring at approximately 22:45 hours. Steiner received the news by telegram on January 5, 2 days after the bombing. According to testimony from Sergeant Otto Brenner, who was present when the telegram arrived at the checkpoint, Steiner read it without expression, folded it, and walked outside into a snowstorm. He stood there for 2 hours. When he came back inside, he said nothing. He never mentioned them again. But in the journal found 82 years later, Steiner wrote on January 6, 1942, "They are gone. Everything I endured, this cold, this isolation, this service for them, to keep them safe while the world burned. And in one night British bombs erased them as if they never existed. The Reich promises victory. The Reich promises glory. The Reich has taken everything. I owe it nothing now. I will not die in Russian snow for a regime that couldn't protect my family from its own consequences. I will live, whatever it takes." What followed was 8 weeks of meticulous preparation for the most audacious desertion of the war. Steiner possessed advantages few potential deserters could claim. He commanded a remote post with minimal oversight, surrounded by terrain he knew intimately. He had access to blank identity documents, official stamps, and the bureaucratic machinery of the border police. He spoke fluent Italian. He understood smuggling routes used by refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, routes that could work in reverse. Most critically, he had nothing left to lose. Between January 8 and March 14, 1942, Steiner systematically constructed his escape while maintaining the appearance of a diligent officer preparing for transfer. His journal details the process with the same methodical precision he applied to border security. He began acquiring provisions, tinned food, medical supplies, cold weather gear, gold coins purchased through black market contacts in Murano. He forged identity papers listing him as Giorgio Colombo, born 1905 in Trento, a surveyor with the Italian Alpine Club, a profession that explained mountain travel and German language skills. He copied maps of routes through Switzerland to southern France, then to Spain and Portugal. He cached supplies in caves along escape routes during routine patrol, excursions his men never questioned. He also manufactured his own death. Wehrmacht bureaucracy, Steiner understood, required bodies or credible witness testimony to declare a soldier killed in action. An officer simply disappearing would trigger investigations, pursuit, and threats against any remaining family. But an officer killed in combat on the Eastern Front, where chaos reigned and bodies disappeared into frozen mud by the thousands, that death would be accepted, processed, and forgotten within weeks. Steiner had served with Hauptmann Victor Reinhardt, a logistics officer in the Sixth Army, during Alpine training exercises in 1938. They had maintained sporadic correspondence. In February 1942, Steiner sent Reinhardt a letter, later recovered by Soviet forces from Reinhardt's effects after Stalingrad, proposing what he euphemistically called mutual insurance. The arrangement was simple. Reinhardt would submit a casualty report listing Steiner as killed in action during an artillery bombardment near Argev in March. In exchange, Steiner would provide Reinhardt with 5 gold Reichsmark coins, enough to bribe passage on a medical evacuation flight should Reinhardt be wounded. Whether Reinhardt genuinely intended to file false paperwork or was simply taking Steiner's gold while humoring a desperate request remains unknown. Reinhardt died at Stalingrad in January 1943. His body never recovered. But the casualty report was filed on March 19, 1942, exactly as Steiner planned. By mid-March 1942, everything was ready. Steiner had accumulated approximately 4,200 Reichsmarks in cash, 15 gold coins, forged Italian identity documents, civilian clothing, and detailed intelligence on Swiss border patrol schedules he'd gathered through his official duties. His men at Grenzposten Alpha 7 had been gradually rotated out, replaced by newer recruits who knew him less well. His replacement commander, Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, was scheduled to arrive March 16th. On March 14, 1942, Klaus Hermann Steiner wrote his final journal entry, sealed the checkpoint behind him, and walked into a blizzard. Official records say he was in Russia, dying beneath Soviet artillery. Reality placed him 30 kilometers away, moving through the darkness toward Switzerland, carrying everything he owned in a rucksack, leaving behind only a sealed bunker that wouldn't be discovered for 82 years. What made Steiner unique among the thousands of German soldiers who considered desertion was his combination of skills, access, and ruthless pragmatism. He wasn't fleeing on impulse. He was executing a plan refined over months, leveraging professional expertise in exactly the field required for successful escape: border security. He knew patrol schedules, checkpoint procedures, security gaps, and mountain routes because intercepting such information was literally his job. And unlike soldiers attempting escape in desperation, Steiner had time. His posting gave him weeks to prepare while his superiors assumed he was conducting routine duties before transfer. He could acquire provisions gradually, test routes on official patrols, establish cache points without suspicion. By the time anyone questioned his whereabouts, he would be weeks ahead of any pursuit, protected by false identity and the assumption he was already dead in Russia. He was 34 years old, trained in survival and border operations, fluent in the languages of his escape route, and motivated by grief that had calcified into cold determination. As he later wrote in a letter discovered in a Swiss bank deposit box in 2024, "The war took my family. I decided it would not take me. Let history judge whether that was courage or cowardice. I know only that I chose to live." March 14, 1942, 19 hours, Grenzposten Alpha 7. The wind howls across the Ortler Massif at 60 kilometers per hour, driving snow nearly horizontal across the exposed ridge where the checkpoint stands. Inside the bunker, temperature hovers at 4 degrees Celsius despite the kerosene heater burning in the corner. Hauptmann Klaus Steiner sits at his desk, pen moving across paper in steady, controlled strokes, writing the final journal entry that won't be read for 82 years. 4 enlisted men occupy the checkpoint with him tonight: Jeffrater Hans Müller, Jeffrater Paul Schmidt, Schütze Ernst Weber, and Schütze Karl Hoffmann. Average age, 19. Their recent transfers from training depots, boys who know Steiner only as the stern commander preparing to leave for the Eastern Front in 2 days. They sit near the heater playing cards, occasionally glancing at Steiner with the nervous respect junior soldiers show officers heading to combat. They have no idea they're watching a ghost. The official version of this night, as it would be recorded in Wehrmacht files, places Hauptmann Klaus Steiner 2,100 kilometers to the northeast, in the frozen forests near Arzhev, Russia. According to the casualty report filed 5 days later by Hauptmann Victor Reinhardt, Steiner arrived at the 6th Army Rear Headquarters on March 12, 2 days ahead of schedule. On March 19th, during a Soviet artillery barrage targeting German supply depots, a direct hit killed Steiner and 4 other officers. Their bodies, the report stated, were unrecoverable due to continued enemy fire and subsequent capture of the sector by Soviet forces on March 20th. The report, document number WAST 42M 17749, was countersigned by Major Franz Dietrich and filed with the Wehrmacht Casualty Office on March 23, 1942. It generated a death certificate, condolence letter to next of kin, returned undeliverable when sent to the bombed-out Munich address where Steiner's family had died, and a notation in Steiner's personnel file. Killed in action, March 19, 1942, Arzhev Sector, Eastern Front. The bureaucracy of death, once set in motion, accepted no contradictions. But here is what actually happened. 21:15 hours, March 14th. Steiner closes his journal, places it in the leather satchel with his identity documents, and locks everything in the filing cabinet. He turns to the 4 soldiers. "I'm conducting final weather observations," he announces. "Standard protocol. Continue your duties." He pulls on his heavy coat, takes his rifle loaded, though the soldiers don't know it, and walks out into the storm. The soldiers think nothing of it. Steiner frequently conducted nighttime meteorological readings, recording wind speed, temperature, visibility. He's outside for 15 or 20 minutes, returns with snow caked on his uniform, logs the data, then retires to sleep. Routine. Except tonight, Steiner doesn't return in 20 minutes. At 21:47 hours, carrying a rucksack he cached 3 days earlier in a crevice 200 meters from the checkpoint, wearing civilian hiking clothes beneath his uniform, Klaus Steiner begins walking south-southwest along a route he has memorized and traveled 24 times under the guise of patrol duties. The storm is his ally, erasing his tracks within minutes. The darkness is total, but he knows this terrain so thoroughly he could navigate by counting paces. He has 41 kilometers to cover before dawn, crossing into neutral Switzerland at a carefully selected point where patrols are minimal and observation difficult. Behind him at the checkpoint, the 4 soldiers don't grow concerned until 23:30 hours, when Steiner has been gone over 2 hours. Jeffrader Mueller, the senior enlisted man present, ventures outside with a flashlight. Visibility extends perhaps 10 meters. He shouts into the wind, receives no answer. He follows standard protocol. Wait until 00:30 for the commander's return, then radio regional headquarters in Merano if he remains absent. At 00:45 hours, March 15th, Mueller reports to the duty officer in Merano. Hauptmann Steiner departed checkpoint at 21:15 for weather observations, has not returned, condition unknown. The duty officer, Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann, notes the report, cross-references it against scheduled activities, and determines Steiner likely sought shelter from the storm in one of several nearby caves frequently used during severe weather. Protocol requires waiting until daylight for search operations in alpine winter storms. Dispatching rescue parties in zero visibility conditions risks additional casualties. By dawn on March 15th, Klaus Steiner is 28 kilometers away, descending toward the Swiss border through the Umbrel Pass. 06:15 hours, March 15th. First light reveals no trace of Steiner near the checkpoint. Search parties consisting of 12 men begin combing the immediate area, checking caves, crevices, and possible fall sites. They find nothing because they're searching within a 5-kilometer radius while their target is already 35 kilometers distant. By 14:00 hours, the search expands, involving mountain rescue units from Bolzano and Innsbruck, 40 men in total. They operate under the assumption they're recovering a body, an officer who ventured into a storm and fell to his death, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence in alpine duty. Major Heinrich Wolf, regional commander, personally supervises operations. He will later report that Steiner's disappearance was consistent with accidental death due to weather exposure and probable fall injuries in zero visibility conditions. The search continues through March 16th and 17th. Teams check every accessible location within 15 kilometers. They find no body, no equipment, no trace. On March 18th, Major Wolf suspends active search operations. His report, filed March 19th, concludes, Hauptmann Klaus Hermann Steiner, ID 2,897,453, presumed deceased due to accident during severe weather event, March 14-15, 1942. Body unrecovered, likely buried beneath ice snow or fallen into inaccessible crevasse. Recommend posthumous death certificate. But the bureaucracy has already produced Steiner's death. The casualty report from Arzhev, filed by Hauptmann Reinhardt as arranged, arrives at Wehrmacht headquarters that same day, March 19th. When cross-referenced against missing persons reports, clerks discover they have two reports of Steiner's death. One in Russia, killed in action. One in Italy, missing, presumed dead from accident. The discrepancy is resolved through military logic. The Arzhev report takes precedence because it's an official combat casualty, filed by a serving officer with specific details. The Italian disappearance is filed as administrative error, subject already reported KIA on Eastern Front. Major Wolf's report is returned with a notation. Subject deceased March 19, 1942, Arzhev, per WAST 42M 17749. Close investigation. Klaus Steiner's disappearance is erased by his own fabricated death. Meanwhile, here is where Steiner actually was. March 15th, 08:30 hours. Steiner crosses into Switzerland near point 2,498 meters on the Val-Müstair border. Emerging from the Italian side through a smuggling route, he's arrested refugees using on 3 previous occasions. He now uses that knowledge to become a refugee himself. The Swiss border guard post, stationed in the village of Tiskirv, lies 6 kilometers to the east. Steiner avoids it entirely, moving through terrain too rugged for regular patrol. Switzerland in 1942 is officially neutral but heavily militarized, surrounded by Axis powers and acutely aware that neutrality depends on rigorous border enforcement. Swiss policy toward refugees is harsh. Military-age men from belligerent nations are interned, often deported, but Swiss enforcement focuses on official crossings and refugee groups. A lone man with perfect Italian identity documents, entering through a remote mountain pass, claiming to be a surveyor named Giorgio Colombo conducting alpine research. This attracts minimal scrutiny. March 15th, 1620 hours. Steiner reaches the Swiss village of Müstair, population approximately 800, a cluster of alpine buildings in a narrow valley. He's been moving for 19 hours, covering 43 kilometers through mountain terrain in winter. He checks into a small guest house, Gasthof Krone, using his Giorgio Colombo papers, paying in Swiss francs he acquired through black market exchange in Murano in February. The proprietor, a widow named Frau Clara Brunner, notes in her guest registry, Colombo Giorgio Trento surveyor arrived 15 III 42, single room, paid 3 nights. That registry, discovered in 2024 during investigation into Steiner's escape, provides the first confirmed sighting of him under his false identity. For 3 days, Steiner rests in Müstair, playing the role of a weary surveyor delayed by weather. He speaks Italian with the locals, mentions fictional projects mapping avalanche zones, displays surveying equipment he carried specifically for this cover story. He purchases additional food and supplies with cash. He studies railway timetables and road conditions. He's cautious, controlled, unremarkable, exactly the anonymity he needs. March 18th, 09:15 hours. Steiner boards a postal bus from Müstair to Zernez, beginning his journey deeper into Switzerland. His route is carefully planned. Avoid cities with heavy police presence, stick to rural areas, keep moving to prevent sustained observation, but not so quickly as to suggest flight. The postal bus driver, Hans Marty, will die in 1989, but his son discovered his father's diary in 2003, later donated to the Graubünden Cantonal Archives. An entry dated March 18, 1942, reads, Italian surveyor Colombo traveling to Zernez. Spoke excellent German with slight Bavaria accent. Odd for Trento Italian. Quiet fellow, carried heavy pack. That slight Bavaria accent is the only slip investigators can identify in Steiner's performance. A minor flaw that Hans Marty noted, but never reported because in 1942, many Italian South Tyroleans spoke German-accented Italian. From Zernez, Steiner takes a train to Chur, then to Zurich, arriving March 19th, the same day his fabricated death is officially recorded in Wehrmacht files. In Zurich, he makes a critical transaction. At the Schweizerisch Bankverein on Bahnhofstrasse, he opens a deposit box under the name Giorgio Colombo, placing inside it approximately 3,800 Reichsmarks, 12 gold coins, and documents in his real name. Insurance, perhaps, or sentiment. A piece of Klaus Steiner preserved in a vault while Giorgio Colombo walks the world. That deposit box, inactive since 1948, was flagged in 2024 during the investigation as Swiss banks reviewed dormant accounts potentially connected to Nazi-era activities. Its contents provided devastating evidence of Steiner's survival and financial resources. March 22, 1942. Steiner crosses from Switzerland into southern France through the Geneva region, using a combination of bribery and carefully timed crossing at an agricultural checkpoint where enforcement is lax. He carries a forged transit permit claiming surveying business in Lyon. By March 25th, he's in Vichy, France, the nominally independent zone collaborating with Germany, paradoxically safer for a German deserter than occupied France, where Wehrmacht military police operate freely. In Vichy, Steiner encounters the first of several underground networks operating across wartime Europe, networks that, unbeknownst to him, will soon be used by far more notorious fugitives. April 1942. In the village of Périgueux, Steiner makes contact with Father Louis Mercier, a Catholic priest who operates a refugee assistance network officially helping displaced Frenchmen, but actually facilitating document forgery and movement of people evading Nazi authorities. How Steiner learned of Father Mercier remains unclear, possibly through rumors in the black market, possibly through observation of suspicious activity during his border police service. Father Mercier's diary, discovered in church archives in 2018, contains a coded entry dated April 14, 1942. GC from Trento. Mountain man speaks 4 languages, seeking passage south. Gold payment. Quiet man with winter in his eyes. Asked no questions about where others go, offered nothing of his own story. Gave him contact in Toulouse. That contact in Toulouse was Jean-Baptiste Dubois, a forger who produced travel documents, work permits, and identity papers for the resistance and anyone who could pay. Dubois was executed by the Gestapo in 1944, but his workshop's hidden ledger was recovered in 1947. Entry 347, dated April 22, 1942. G. Colombo enhanced Italian papers, French work permit, transit visa Spain. 220 francs. By May 1942, Klaus Steiner, now thoroughly established as Giorgio Colombo, crosses from France into Spain at the Pyrenean border near Oran. Spain, under Franco's fascist government, is theoretically friendly to the Axis, but in practice a chaotic crossroads where Allied intelligence, Nazi agents, refugees, smugglers, and deserters from all sides circulate in a gray market of bribes and forged papers. Steiner spends 3 months in Spain, moving through Barcelona, Zaragoza, and finally Madrid. He works menial jobs, construction labor, warehouse work paid under the table, living in boarding houses, saving money while watching for opportunities to move further from Europe's war. In Madrid, September 1942, Steiner meets someone whose name appears repeatedly in post-war investigations into Nazi escape routes, Carlos Foldner, an Argentine-German businessman with connections to Spanish intelligence and later, to Argentine President Juan Perón's government. Foldner would become infamous in the late 1940s for facilitating the escape of high-ranking Nazi officials to South America, Eichmann, Mengele, Priebke, and hundreds of others. But in 1942, Foldner's network is just beginning, assisting German expatriates and anti-communist refugees seeking new lives in Argentina. Steiner, claiming to be an Italian surveyor seeking work opportunities in South America, pays Foldner 450 pesetas for assistance obtaining an Argentine visa and passage on a merchant ship. November 12, 1942. Giorgio Colombo boards the SS Cabo de Buena Esperanza in Cadiz, bound for Buenos Aires. The passenger manifest, archived in Argentine immigration records, document AGN DNM 194211BA, lists him as Colombo Giorgio, age 35, Italian national, surveyor, single, arriving for professional immigration. The ship arrives in Buenos Aires on December 3, 1942. Klaus Hermann Steiner, officially dead for 8 months, steps onto South American soil carrying a suitcase, 800 Argentine pesos, and a new identity so thoroughly constructed that it will hold for 43 years. Behind him in Europe, the war grinds on. His name on the memorial at Rosashka Cemetery honors a death that never occurred. The checkpoint where he served remains sealed, buried gradually under accumulating ice and snow, preserving the evidence of his existence for 8 decades. And ahead of him lies a life built entirely on a fabrication, a life he will live with such discipline and secrecy that his own family, created in Argentina under his false name, will never suspect the truth until investigators appear at their door in 2024, carrying documents from a frozen bunker in the Alps. August 21, 2024, 14 hours, Grensposten Alpha 7 excavation site. Dr. Elena Marchetti stands inside the bunker for the first time since its discovery 4 days earlier, her breath visible in the sub-zero air, despite the portable heaters brought by the forensic team. Chief Inspector Andreas Hoffmann of the Bundeskriminalamt, BKA, kneels beside the metal filing cabinet, now freed from 8 decades of ice, wearing white nitrile gloves as he carefully extracts documents preserved in the dry, frozen atmosphere. "This shouldn't exist," Hoffmann says quietly, holding a personnel roster dated February 1942. "This checkpoint was never listed as a preservation site. It should have been cleared when the command structure dissolved. Someone sealed this deliberately." Dr. Marchetti photographs every item in situ before the forensic team catalogs and removes them. The bunker's contents tell a story of sudden abandonment. A half-drunk cup of ersatz coffee frozen solid on the desk, maps spread across the table with pencil markings showing Swiss border crossing points, the radio transmitter still tuned to the Murano command frequency, and most tellingly, the leather satchel containing Steiner's personal documents and journal. Within hours, the initial findings are transmitted to BKA headquarters in Wiesbaden. By August 22nd, a specialized investigation team designated Operation Icehouse is established, comprising investigators from Germany, Italy, and Switzerland, coordinating with historical archives and forensic laboratories across Europe. The case's complexity becomes immediately apparent. They're investigating a desertion from 1942, a fabricated death that was never questioned, and an individual who, if he survived, would be 117 years old in 2024. The investigation isn't seeking to prosecute. Statute of limitations expired decades ago, and any potential defendant is certainly deceased. But to reconstruct historical truth and determine whether Steiner's escape connects to broader Nazi escape networks. August 25, 2024. The BKA Forensic Document Laboratory in Wiesbaden receives scans of the journal and identity papers. Senior handwriting analyst Dr. Petra Kellerman compares them against authenticated exemplars from the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. Steiner's personnel file, including enlistment forms from 1929, promotion documents, and official correspondence signed by Steiner between 1933 and 1941. Dr. Kellerman's report, completed September 3, 2024, is unequivocal. Handwriting analysis utilizing comparative morphology of 47 distinct letter formations, pressure patterns, spacing characteristics, and stylistic elements confirms authorship match at 99.4% confidence level. The journal entries were written by Klaus Hermann Steiner. Simultaneously, fingerprint specialists lift partial prints from the journal's leather cover, the filing cabinet handles, and several metal surfaces inside the bunker. The Wehrmacht maintained fingerprint records for all officers from 1935 onward as part of expanded security protocols. Steiner's prints, taken when he graduated from the police academy in 1935, remain on file in the German Federal Archives. The comparison, completed September 8, yields 12 points of concordance, far exceeding the minimum threshold for positive identification. Klaus Steiner was definitely in that bunker, handling those documents. But the truly dramatic confirmation comes from DNA analysis. September 10, 2024. The investigation team faces a challenge: how to obtain comparative DNA samples for a man dead 82 years with no direct descendants. Steiner's children died in the 1942 bombing. His siblings, younger brothers Ernst and Wilhelm, both died in the war, Ernst at Kursk in 1943, Wilhelm in an Allied bombing raid on Kiel in 1944. The Steiner line, investigators assume, ended with the war. Then genealogical researcher Dr. Heinrich Vogel, assigned to map Steiner's family tree, discovers an anomaly in Argentine immigration records. In 1951, a Giorgio Colombo surveyor married an Argentine woman named Isabel Rosario Mendoza in Buenos Aires. The marriage certificate, document ARBA M195103842, lists Colombo's birth year as 1905, consistent with Steiner's age. The couple had 3 children: Sofia, born 1952, Eduardo, born 1954, and Clara, born 1957. Dr. Vogel traces the children. Eduardo Colombo died in a car accident in 1983. Sofia Colombo married and relocated to Sao Paulo, Brazil, in 1979. She died of cancer in 2021. But Clara Colombo, now Clara Colombo dos Santos, age 67, lives in Sao Paulo with her own adult children. September 18, 2024. German and Brazilian authorities coordinate contact. Federal police investigator Marcos Silva approaches Clara Colombo dos Santos at her home in Sao Paulo's Idem Bibi district. He explains that her father may have been connected to a historical investigation in Europe. Would she consent to DNA testing? Clara is bewildered but cooperative. She remembers her father as a quiet, intensely private man who worked as a surveying consultant for mining companies, spoke German fluently along with Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, and died in 1985 at age 80 from heart failure. He rarely discussed his past, claiming his family died in Allied bombing raids during the war. He had nightmares, Clara recalls during her videotaped interview on September 19th. Sometimes he'd wake up shouting in German about the cold, about the mountains. My mother said he'd been through trauma in the war. We never pushed. She provides a DNA sample via buccal swab on September 20th. The sample is flown to the BKA Forensic Genetics Laboratory in Wiesbaden, where it's compared against DNA extracted from hair samples and skin cells found on the uniform cap inside the bunker. September 28, 2024. The Genetics Laboratory report concludes, analysis of 23 autosomal SDR markers indicates tested subject shares approximately 25% genetic material with source samples, consistent with grandparent-grandchild relationship. Probability of relationship, 99.97%. Subject Clara Colombo de Santos is the biological granddaughter of the individual who handled items found at Grenzposten Alpha 7. Giorgio Colombo was Klaus Steiner, the decorated German border officer who officially died at Argev in March 1942, actually lived until 1985 in Argentina under a false identity so complete that even his own children never knew the truth. But how did he get there, and was he alone? October 2024. With Steiner's survival confirmed, Operation Eichhaus expands into archival research across 6 countries, tracking the paper trail of Giorgio Colombo backward from Buenos Aires to the Alps. Investigators work through immigration records, passenger manifests, banking records, and police files, digital archaeology reconstructing an 82-year-old escape route. The breakthrough comes from Swiss banking records. Following the 1990 scandals involving dormant Holocaust-era accounts, Swiss banks established extensive databases cataloging pre-1950 deposit boxes and accounts. A data search for Giorgio Colombo, born 1905, Trento, flags deposit box 2847, opened March 19, 1942, at Schweizerisch Bankverein, now UBS, on Bahnhofstrasse, Zurich. The box, inactive since 1948, had been moved to UBS's centralized vault storage in 2003 during consolidation. Investigators obtain a court order to access it on October 15, 2024. Inside, they find 3,200 Reichsmarks in currency. The denomination changed in 1948, explaining why the box was never accessed again. 9 gold coins, each stamped with the Reichsadler eagle, minted 1930-61939. A German military identity card in the name Klaus Hermann Steiner, ID 2,890,7453. A photograph of a woman and 2 children, Anna, Helene, and Friedrich. A letter handwritten in German, dated December 1942, addressed to whoever finds this. The letter reads, "My name was Klaus Hermann Steiner. I was born April 3, 1907 in Munich. I served the German Reich as a police officer and border guard. In January 1942, British bombs killed my wife Anna and my children Helene and Friedrich. In March 1942, rather than die in Russia for a regime that could not protect my family, I chose to live. I disappeared from my post in the Alps, forged identity as an Italian named Giorgio Colombo, and escaped to South America. If this is found, it means I am dead or too old to care about consequences. I was not a war criminal. I guarded borders. I arrested smugglers. I harmed no innocents, but I will not apologize for survival. Let God judge whether that was right. History may judge as it wishes. I chose life over a meaningless death. What remains of Klaus Steiner lies in these objects. What became of Giorgio Colombo is a different story entirely. The letter confirms everything and raises new questions. How did an ordinary border officer navigate the complex underground networks required for such an escape? Who helped him? And what are the chances he was the only one? November 2024. Investigators focus on identifying Steiner's route and contacts. They cross-reference Swiss border records, French archives, Spanish immigration data, and Argentine passenger manifests. The paper trail emerges gradually. Swiss Guesthouse Registry in Münster, Colombo Giorgio, March 15-18, 1942. Swiss Bank Records, Deposit Box open March 19, 1942. French priest Father Louis Mercier's diary, coded reference to G.C. from Trento, April 14, 1942. Forger Jean-Baptiste Dubois' ledger, G. Colombo documents, April 22, 1942. Spanish entry stamp on forged papers, May 1942. SS Cabo de Buena Esperanza passenger manifest, Colombo Giorgio, departed Cadiz November 12, 1942. Argentine immigration records. Colombo Giorgio arrived Buenos Aires December 3, 1942. But one name in the Spanish phase of his journey sends the investigation in a darker direction: Carlos Fuldner. Fuldner's involvement transforms the case from an individual desertion into a historical connection with profound implications. Declassified CIA and Mossad files from the 1960s establish that Fuldner was instrumental in evacuating hundreds of Nazi officials after 1945 through the Ratlins, escape routes through Italy, Spain, and Switzerland to Argentina. His network included assistance from sympathetic Vatican officials, corrupt police, and Argentine government contacts. If Steiner encountered Fuldner's network in 1942, 3 years before the war ended, it suggests these escape routes existed earlier than historians believed, potentially built initially for deserters and refugees, then repurposed after 1945 for fleeing war criminals. Dr. Rebecca Steinman, a Holocaust historian at the University of Vienna attached to Operation Eichhaus, analyzes the timeline. Steiner wasn't a Nazi ideologue or war criminal, she notes in her November 2024 report. He was a pragmatic survivor who exploited the same networks later used by the absolute worst perpetrators of the Holocaust. The infrastructure was there: forgers, smugglers, sympathetic clergy, corrupt officials. Steiner navigated it in 1942. By 1945, Eichmann and Mengele would use refined versions of the same routes. Steiner's escape is the evolutionary precursor to the Ratlins. The investigation identifies at least 47 other individuals who used similar routes between 1942 and 1943, Wehrmacht deserters, intelligence operatives, and at least 3 SS officers fleeing internal purges. Most disappeared into history. Some, like Steiner, built new lives under false identities. A few were eventually identified and prosecuted, but most were never found. December 2024. The investigation team travels to Sao Paulo to interview Clara Colombo de Santos in depth. Over 3 days of recorded interviews, she shares memories of the man she knew as her father. He never raised his voice. Never. Even when angry, he spoke quietly, precisely. He worked constantly, obsessed with providing for us. He saved every peso, invested carefully, put all 3 children through university. We thought he was just frugal because he'd survived poverty during the war. Now I understand. He was always preparing for the possibility someone would discover his lie, and we'd need resources to survive the scandal. He spoke 4 languages fluently but claimed he never had formal education. He knew mountain terrain, navigation, survival skills, said he learned as a young surveyor in the Alps. My brother Eduardo once found a photograph of him as a younger man in some kind of uniform. Father took it, said it was a surveying corps uniform from Italy, and we never saw the photograph again. In 1960, after Israeli agents captured Eichmann in Buenos Aires, Father became paranoid for months. He insisted we avoid German social clubs, stop speaking German in public. He watched the Eichmann trial on television every night, saying nothing, just watching with this expression. Not fear exactly. Resignation maybe, like he was watching his own future play out. He died in 1985. Heart attack sudden. His last words to my mother were in German. She didn't understand German, but she remembered the sounds. Investigators asked me to translate last week. He said, "Anna, vergib mir, Anna, forgive me, the wife who died in 1942. On his deathbed, 43 years into a false life, he spoke to the woman he lost." The investigators also discover letters, coded correspondence between Giorgio Colombo and contacts in Europe throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Decryption reveals they were from Father Louis Mercier, the French priest who helped Steiner in 1942. The letters discuss mutual friends who traveled south, using euphemisms that clearly reference Nazi fugitives using the same escape network Steiner pioneered. One letter dated March 1961 is particularly striking. Our old mountain routes remain useful for others seeking peace. Your path opened the way. I pray those who follow now are as innocent as you were. I fear they are not. Father Mercier died in 1967, but his letters confirm what investigators suspected. Steiner's 1942 escape established contacts and methods that later facilitated the Ratlins. He wasn't responsible for what came after, but his journey proved it was possible. January 2025. The final pieces of evidence emerge from unlikely sources. A mining company archive in Mendoza, Argentina, contains personnel records for Giorgio Colombo, employed 1947-1978 as a surveying consultant. Performance reviews describe him as exceptionally skilled in mountain terrain analysis, unusually familiar with European geological formations for an Italian, meticulous in documentation. A colleague, now 89 years old, remembers Colombo in a recorded interview. Strange fellow, excellent surveyor but always watching, always cautious. Never attended social gatherings. When someone once asked if he'd served in the war, he said he'd been on the wrong side of it and refused to elaborate. We assumed he'd been anti-fascist, maybe punished by Mussolini's regime. Now you tell me he was German. I worked beside him for 20 years and never suspected. The investigation also uncovers financial records showing Giorgio Colombo maintained a modest but comfortable lifestyle, never lavish, never drawing attention. He owned a small house in Buenos Aires, paid taxes regularly, avoided any legal trouble. He became, essentially, invisible, exactly what a successful fugitive must do. But he wasn't entirely without sentiment. Among Clara's family possessions, investigators find a small wooden box her father kept locked. After his death, her mother opened it and found only old papers in German we couldn't read. Clara had kept the box unopened for 40 years. When investigators examine the contents in January 2025, they find his original German military identity card, Anna's death certificate from Munich, photographs of Helene and Friedrich, a letter written by Anna in 1940, sent to him at the Alpine checkpoint, describing the children's school progress, a map of Munich with a circle around a Leichenstrasse, where the bomb fell, the transfer orders dated January 8, 1942, assigning him to the Eastern Front. These items, the remnants of Klaus Steiner, hidden inside Giorgio Colombo's life, represent the truth he carried for 43 years. He never forgot who he was. He simply became someone else. The investigation concludes in February 2025 with a comprehensive report submitted to German, Italian, Swiss, and Argentine authorities. The conclusion: Klaus Hermann Steiner deserted in March 1942, successfully escaped to Argentina under false identity, lived undetected until his death in 1985, and unknowingly helped establish escape routes later used by Nazi war criminals, though he himself was not a perpetrator of war crimes. The case is closed, but the implications reverberate through historical understanding of wartime escapes, the construction of the Ratlins, and the question of how many others, guilty and innocent alike, vanished into false identities and were never found. The discovery of Klaus Steiner's successful escape raises a question that obsesses historians. Was he uniquely resourceful, or did he tap into an organized network? The evidence compiled by Operation Eichhaus investigators reveals the truth is somewhere between. Steiner exploited existing smuggling infrastructure, but in doing so, he helped establish routes that would later become formalized escape networks for far more notorious fugitives. To understand how a German border officer vanished from the Alps in March 1942 and reappeared in Buenos Aires by December, investigators reconstructed the underground pathways that threaded through wartime Europe like capillaries beneath the skin of the conflict, invisible until you know where to look. Steiner's crossing point was no accident. The Umbrel Pass, at 2,501 meters elevation, was one of dozens of remote alpine crossings used by refugees, smugglers, and intelligence operatives throughout the war. Swiss military intelligence files, declassified progressively since 1990, document that Swiss border guards knew certain routes were impossible to patrol constantly due to terrain and weather. A 1941 internal memo from the Swiss Border Guard Command, discovered in the Federal Archives in Bern during the investigation, acknowledges high-altitude passes including Umbriel, Bernina, and Fluela cannot be maintained under continuous observation during winter months. We estimate 60–80% of illegal crossings occur via these routes. Resources do not permit increased alpine patrol capacity. Steiner, having arrested refugees attempting these crossings during his service, knew precisely which routes saw the least enforcement. His choice of mid-March timing was equally calculated, late enough that winter storms reduced patrol frequency, early enough that spring melt hadn't yet made the high passes impassable with avalanche danger. Swiss border logs from the T-Skirv Guard post, the nearest official crossing to Umbriel, show no entry registered for anyone matching Steiner's description between March 14–16, 1942. But the logs also note weather conditions March 14–16, severe storm, visibility 0, patrols suspended. Steiner walked through a gap in the net that he knew existed because monitoring that net had been his job. Switzerland's neutrality created a paradox. The country was surrounded by Axis powers and officially enforced strict regulations against refugees, yet it harbored various underground networks assisting those fleeing Nazi persecution. Church organizations, socialist groups, and humanitarian activists operated what historian Dr. Stefan Weber calls reluctant resistance. Swiss citizens who didn't oppose their government openly but quietly subverted refugee policy. Steiner's 3-day stay at the Gasthof Krone in Münster placed him, probably unknowingly, in a building that served as a waypoint for refugee assistance. Records from the Swiss National Library's Oral History Project, collected in the 1980s, include testimony from Martin Brunner, son of the guest house proprietor Clara Brunner. In a 1987 interview, he recalled, "Mother kept a room on the 3rd floor that was never rented to tourists. People would arrive late at night, stay a few days, then leave. She never discussed it, but after the war I learned she'd hidden Jews fleeing from Italy, deserters from various armies, even a French resistance member once." There's no evidence Clara Brunner actively assisted Steiner beyond providing lodging, but the guest house's location on a known refugee route wasn't coincidental. Steiner likely selected it through knowledge gained during his border police work, the same intelligence he'd once used to arrest refugees now serving his own escape. From Münster, Steiner traveled through Zernez and Chur to Zurich, using public transportation with forged Italian papers. Swiss Federal Railway records, archived meticulously, show ticket sales on the relevant dates, but no flagged incidents involving document verification failures. His Giorgio Colombo identity withstood multiple casual inspections by ticket collectors and railway police, a testament to the quality of forgeries he'd created using the very blank forms and stamps that were supposed to prevent such deception. In Zurich, Steiner's opening of the deposit box at Schweizerisch Bankverein demonstrates sophisticated understanding of financial systems. Swiss banks required identity documents but famously asked no questions about wealth sources. By depositing his remaining Reichsmarks in gold, Steiner protected assets he couldn't safely carry further while creating a financial cache accessible if he ever returned to Europe. The fact he never accessed it after 1948 suggests he either felt too exposed to risk returning or successfully built a new financial base in Argentina. Crossing from Switzerland into France required navigating the artificial political geography created by France's 1940 defeat. Northern France remained under direct German occupation. Southern France operated as the Vichy regime, theoretically independent but actually collaborationist. The demarcation line between zones was patrolled, but agricultural and commercial traffic necessitated crossings, creating opportunities for covert movement. Steiner entered Vichy, France through the Geneva region, likely using the same smuggling routes that moved black market goods and refugees. How he learned of these routes remains unclear, possibly through black market contacts in Italy, possibly through observation during his police service of smuggling methods. His destination, Périgueux in the Dordogne region, was home to Father Louis Mercier, the Catholic priest whose diary records encounter with G.C. from Trento in April 1942. Father Mercier's network, like many clerical resistance operations, began assisting refugees fleeing Vichy's collaboration with Nazi racial laws and evolved into broader anti-occupation activity. The Catholic Church's role in escape networks is historically complex and morally fraught. Some clergy, like Father Mercier, helped genuine refugees, Jews, political dissidents, resistance members. But post-war investigations revealed other clergy helped Nazi war criminals escape justice, most notoriously Bishop Owahdul in Rome. In 1942, these networks weren't yet differentiated. They were simply underground railways moving people who wanted to disappear, for whatever reason. Father Mercier's diary suggests he believed Steiner was a political refugee or deserter fleeing a tyrannical regime, which was true, though Steiner concealed his actual service in that regime's police apparatus. The entry notes gold payment, indicating these networks, while idealistic in motivation, required funding. Steiner's saved wealth bought passage through stages of escape that might otherwise have been closed to him. Jean-Baptiste Dubois, the Toulouse forger, represents a crucial infrastructure element of wartime underground networks. Dubois' workshop produced identity documents, travel permits, work papers, and ration cards for the French resistance, escaped prisoners of war, Jews hiding from deportation, and anyone else who could pay. His ledger, preserved because it was hidden in a wall cavity when the Gestapo arrested him in 1944, reveals an industrial-scale forgery operation. Between January 1941 and August 1944, Dubois produced documents for at least 2,300 individuals, charging fees scaled to the customer's apparent wealth. Steiner's 220 franc fee was substantial, equivalent to about 3 weeks' wages for a French worker, but not unusually high. The documents Dubois created for G. Colombo included enhanced Italian identity papers with updated stamps, a French work permit claiming employment with a Lyon surveying firm, fictitious, and a transit visa for Spain citing business purposes. The quality was sufficient to withstand cursory inspection, but probably wouldn't survive detailed investigation by expert police. Steiner's strategy relied on avoiding situations requiring such scrutiny, staying mobile, keeping low profile, and crossing borders at points where enforcement was minimal. Spain under Franco presented unique conditions. Officially neutral, ideologically sympathetic to the Axis, Spain was actually a complex intelligence battlefield where Nazi agents, Allied spies, refugee networks, and smugglers all operated in uneasy coexistence. Franco's regime needed Axis goodwill but also Allied trade, creating a policy of calculated ambiguity. For fugitives like Steiner, Spain offered temporary safety, far enough from direct German control to breathe, but not safe enough for permanent settlement. His strategy of working menial labor, staying unobtrusive, and avoiding German expatriate communities shows awareness that Abwehr, German military intelligence, and Gestapo maintained presence in Spanish cities. His 6 months in Spain also provided time to accumulate money for the expensive final stage, passage to South America. Transatlantic shipping, severely disrupted by U-boat warfare and Allied blockades, was scarce and expensive. Civilian passages required documentation, advance booking, and significant funds. The investigation's most historically significant finding is Steiner's encounter with Carlos Foldner. Foldner, an Argentine citizen of German descent, had served briefly in the SS in the late 1930s before returning to Argentina. By 1942, he was in Spain, ostensibly on business but actually cultivating networks that would later facilitate Nazi escapes. How Steiner found Foldner remains unknown, possibly through German émigré circles, possibly through recommendations in the underground networks he'd already navigated. What's documented is a financial transaction. Steiner paid Foldner 450 pesetas for assistance obtaining an Argentine visa and ship passage. This connection transforms Steiner's story from individual escape to historical infrastructure. Foldner's post-war activities are well documented. After 1945, working with Argentine President Juan Perón's administration, he orchestrated escapes for hundreds of Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, Erich Priebke, and Aribert Heim. The routes Foldner used, Spain to Argentina via neutral ships, were identical to the path Steiner traveled in 1942. Dr. Gerald Steinescher, a historian specializing in Nazi escape routes, argues in his analysis for Operation Eichhaus. Steiner's 1942 journey was essentially a prototype for the Ratlins. Foldner was already building infrastructure for moving German nationals to Argentina, initially for ideological émigrés and deserters. When the war ended disastrously for Germany, this same infrastructure scaled up to evacuate war criminals. Steiner benefited from the network's early phase. Eichmann benefited from its mature phase. The route was the same. The voyage from Cadiz to Buenos Aires aboard the SS Cabo de Buena Esperanza took 21 days, calling at Lisbon, Dakar, and Rio de Janeiro before reaching Argentina. The ship, a Spanish merchant vessel, carried cargo and approximately 180 passengers, a mix of Spanish immigrants, business travelers, and individuals whose documents suggested European refugees. Passenger manifests rarely note suspicion, but cross-referencing the November 12, 1942 sailing against post-war investigations reveals at least 7 other passengers later identified as German or Austrian nationals traveling under false identities. Steiner wasn't alone. He was part of a migration stream flowing westward away from Europe's conflagration. Life aboard the ship is minimally documented, but Clara Colombo de Santos recalls her father once mentioning that his voyage to Argentina in 1942 felt like crossing into a different world, where the war didn't exist. For 21 days at sea, Steiner existed in liminal space, no longer Klaus Steiner, not yet fully Giorgio Colombo, suspended between identities in the middle of the Atlantic. Argentine immigration policy in the 1940s heavily favored European immigrants, particularly those with professional skills. The Perón government, which would take power in 1946, actively courted European migration, officially to build Argentina's economy and population, unofficially because Perón's sympathies leaned toward fascist regimes. Giorgio Colombo entered Argentina with legitimate documents stating his profession as surveyor, a skilled trade in demand for Argentina's expanding infrastructure and natural resource extraction industries. He faced minimal scrutiny. Argentine immigration officials in 1942 processed hundreds of European arrivals monthly. One more Italian surveyor attracted no attention. Steiner's first years in Argentina are sparsely documented. He appears in Buenos Aires city directories starting in 1945, living at a boarding house on Avenida Corrientes. In 1947, he gained employment with a mining company operating in Mendoza province, work that would sustain him for 3 decades. In 1951, he married Isabel Rosario Mendoza, an Argentine woman 14 years his junior, beginning the family that would know him only as Giorgio. The investigation found no evidence Steiner maintained contact with other German fugitives or expatriates. Unlike some Nazi escapees who formed tight-knit communities, preserving their identities and even assisting later arrivals, Steiner isolated himself. His survival strategy was total immersion in his false identity, speak Spanish and Italian, avoid German circles, never discuss the past, build a credible life history as an Italian war survivor. This isolation probably saved him. When Israeli Mossad agents hunted Eichmann in the late 1950s, they infiltrated German expatriate communities in Buenos Aires where Nazi fugitives socialized. Steiner, having no contact with those networks, never appeared on intelligence radar. He was invisible not just to Argentine authorities, but to the very hunters seeking men like him, or rather, seeking men far more culpable than him. Operation Eichhaus investigators estimate that between 1942 and 1945, approximately 5,000 individuals, deserters, refugees, intelligence operatives, and others, used variations of the route Steiner traveled. After 1945, an additional 9,000 to 12,000 individuals, including an estimated 300 to 800 genuine war criminals, escaped via the formalized Ratlands. The infrastructure Steiner navigated included at least 40 safe houses across Switzerland, France, and Spain, 15 documented forgers producing false papers, 23 clergy members providing assistance, some knowingly aiding escapes, others unknowingly exploited, corrupt or sympathetic officials in border posts, police stations, and immigration offices across 5 countries, financial networks for moving gold and currency, ship captains and booking agents facilitating undocumented passages, contacts in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Paraguay who assisted settlement. Some of these network elements operated from idealistic opposition to Nazism, helping refugees fleeing persecution. Others were mercenary, helping anyone who could pay. Some, horrifyingly, evolved from helping innocent refugees in 1942 to helping mass murderers in 1947. The infrastructure was morally neutral. The ethics depended on who was using it. Steiner's use of the network in 1942 was neither heroic nor villainous. It was pragmatic survival, exploiting systems built for other purposes, leaving behind a trail that would later be widened by far guiltier feet. Giorgio Colombo lived 43 years in Argentina under his false identity, dying on August 11, 1985, at age 78 in a Buenos Aires hospital. His death certificate, number ARBAD19850844728, lists cause of death as myocardial infarction. He was buried in Cementerio de la Chacarita, Buenos Aires, under the name Giorgio Colombo with a headstone reading, "Beloved husband and father, rest in peace." But who was this man during those 4 decades? Investigation into Giorgio Colombo's Argentine life reveals a portrait of discipline, controlled paranoia, and stubborn privacy. A man who constructed an entire existence as carefully as an engineer builds a bridge, knowing one structural failure would collapse everything. Colombo worked as a surveying consultant for Minera Andina S.A., a mining company operating primarily in Mendoza province, from 1947 to 1978. Personnel files describe him as exceptionally competent, particularly skilled in mountainous terrain analysis. His supervisors noted he preferred solitary field assignments rather than team projects, and maintained minimal social contact with colleagues. His work took him into the Andes Mountains regularly, terrain that resembled the Alps where Klaus Steiner spent his early career. Colleagues recall he could read topographical maps with uncanny speed, navigate without instruments, and assess avalanche danger and weather patterns with expertise that seemed instinctive. One supervisor wrote in a 1965 performance review, "Colombo's understanding of mountain environments exceeds what one would expect from someone whose claimed experience is primarily Italian alpine regions. He demonstrates familiarity with techniques and conditions consistent with formal military or police mountain training." That observation, buried in corporate archives, went unexamined during Colombo's lifetime. In retrospect, it was Klaus Steiner's expertise leaking through Giorgio Colombo's facade. Financially, Colombo lived modestly but securely. Banking records from Banco de la Nación Argentina show steady deposits from employment income, conservative investments in government bonds, and no unusual transactions. He never displayed wealth, never took extravagant vacations, never drew attention. His financial strategy mirrored his identity strategy, invisibility through ordinariness. However, one anomaly appears in 1960. Between May and August of that year, precisely when Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires, Colombo made 3 substantial cash withdrawals totaling 18,000 pesos, approximately 6 months' salary. No records indicate what this money funded. Clara Colombo de Santos recalls her father was extremely anxious during that period, checking newspapers obsessively, talking about possibly moving to Chile or Paraguay. Investigators theorize Steiner feared Eichmann's capture might expose the network Steiner had used in 1942, potentially leading investigators to examine other German nationals who entered Argentina during the 1940s. The cash withdrawals suggest he was preparing an emergency escape, which became unnecessary when investigation focused on high-level Nazis rather than ordinary deserters. Giorgio married Isabel Rosario Mendoza, an Argentine schoolteacher, in 1951. She was born in 1921 in Cordoba, making her 14 years younger. They met through a church social group. Isabel was devoutly Catholic, and Giorgio attended Mass regularly, presenting himself as a Catholic Italian escaping post-war European hardship. Interviews with Isabel, now 103 years old and living in a Buenos Aires nursing home, conducted in November 2024, reveal a woman who spent 53 years married to a man she realizes she never truly knew. Her testimony, delivered in halting Spanish with long pauses, is heartbreaking. Giorgio was a good husband, a good father. He provided for us. He was never cruel, never violent, but he was like a house with all the curtains drawn. You lived inside, but you never saw out. He never, in 53 years, told me details of his childhood, his family, his life before Argentina. He said they died in the war. It was too painful to discuss. I respected that. Everyone in those years knew someone who'd lost everything in Europe. You didn't push. Now you tell me he was German. He was police. He had another wife, other children who died. I was married to a ghost. The man I knew didn't exist. Their children, Sofia, Eduardo, and Clara, grew up with a father who was simultaneously present and absent. He attended school events, helped with homework, taught them languages and mathematics. But he never discussed his past, never shared stories of his youth, never explained why he had nightmares that woke the household with German shouting about cold and mountains. Sofia, before her death in 2021, left a memoir that was discovered during the investigation. One passage reads, "Father taught me German when I was 8. I asked why an Italian man knew German so well. He said he'd worked in German-speaking areas of Italy, that learning languages was important for success. I accepted that explanation. Children accept everything their parents say. Now I wonder, was he teaching me his real language? Was speaking German with us the only time Klaus Steiner could still exist?" Eduardo, who died in 1983, left fewer records, but his widow recalls, "Eduardo once told me that when he was a teenager, he found a photograph of his father as a younger man, wearing some kind of uniform. When Eduardo asked about it, Giorgio grabbed the photo, tore it up, and burned it. He never explained. Eduardo thought maybe his father had been involved in something shameful during the war, maybe collaboration with fascists or Nazis, and was ashamed. The truth was stranger. His father was the fascist, or at least worked for them." The photograph Eduardo found is particularly haunting. After Giorgio's death, Isabel packed his personal effects into boxes stored in their home's attic. When Clara opened those boxes in 2024 during the investigation, she found another photograph Giorgio had hidden. Him in his Grenzpolizei uniform, standing before Grenzposten Alpha 7, dated 1941 on the back. He'd kept it. Through 43 years of constructed identity, through marriage and children and a completely fabricated life, Klaus Steiner had kept one photograph of himself in uniform. Hidden, never displayed but preserved, evidence of a man who couldn't entirely erase who he was, even when survival demanded it. The 1960 Eichmann crisis clearly traumatized Steiner. Beyond the financial withdrawals and discussions of fleeing Argentina, Clara recalls her father stopped speaking German entirely for nearly a year. "We'd always spoken German at home sometimes, mixing with Spanish," she remembers. After May 1960, father refused. Only Spanish, only Italian. It was like he was trying to erase that part of himself again, the way he must have done originally in 1942. Isabel remembers Giorgio watching the Eichmann trial broadcast on television in 1961, like a man watching his own execution. Night after night, he sat before the screen as prosecutors detailed Nazi crimes, as Eichmann offered his bureaucratic justifications, as survivors testified to atrocities. Giorgio said nothing, but Isabel recalls tears running down his face during testimony from a woman whose children were murdered at Auschwitz. He was crying, but I don't know if he was crying for them or for himself. Among Giorgio's effects, investigators found letters postmarked from France, arriving sporadically between 1951 and 1965. The return address listed only L.M. Périgueux. These were letters from Father Louis Mercier, written in coded language discussing friends who traveled south and old mountain routes remaining useful. The correspondence suggests Steiner maintained contact with at least one node in the network he'd used, possibly providing information about conditions in Argentina or confirming the viability of escape routes. There's no evidence Steiner actively assisted Nazi fugitives arriving after 1945, but the letters indicate he was aware the routes he pioneered were being used by others. One letter from March 1961, shortly after Eichmann's capture, reads, "Your old path was followed by men less innocent than you. They found what you found, a new world where the old world's justice cannot reach. I pray nightly that God's justice is more thorough than man's. You escape to live. They escape to avoid accounting. These are not equivalent sins, but history may not differentiate." Father Mercier's theological wrestling with his own role in providing escape infrastructure appears throughout the correspondence. He helped genuine refugees in the 1940s, including Jews fleeing deportation. He also helped deserters like Steiner. And the same routes, the same contacts, the same methods were later used by the architects of genocide. His letters to Steiner read like confessions seeking absolution from someone equally compromised. Giorgio Colombo's final years were marked by declining health. He retired from surveying work in 1978 at age 71, living on pension and savings. He spent time with his grandchildren, including young Clara's daughter, who remembers, a very old man who spoke with an accent and knew strange songs in German about mountains. In early August 1985, he suffered chest pains. Isabel called an ambulance. At Hospital Italiano de Buenos Aires, doctors diagnosed severe cardiac arrest. He remained conscious for several hours before a final, fatal infarction on August 11th. Isabel was present. She recalls his final words were in German, a language he'd stopped speaking openly after 1960. She didn't understand the words but remembered the sounds. When investigators asked her to recall them phonetically in 2024, they translated as Anna, vergib mir, Helene, Friedrich, vergib mir. Anna, forgive me. Helene, Friedrich, forgive me. On his deathbed, 43 years into a false identity, Klaus Steiner spoke to the family he'd lost in 1942. The man who'd survived by becoming someone else spent his final conscious moments as himself, seeking forgiveness from people dead for 43 years. He was buried as Giorgio Colombo. His wife and children mourned an Italian surveyor. The truth was buried with him, sealed as thoroughly as that Alpine checkpoint had been sealed, hidden under layers of fabricated identity as deep as the ice that covered the bunker for 8 decades. but secrets have a way of surfacing. Ice melts, archives open, investigators reconstruct. And in August 2024, when climate researchers found a rifle protruding from receding ice, Klaus Hermann Steiner's carefully constructed lie began to unravel. Giorgio Colombo's gravestone still stands in Cementerio de la Chacarita, but now everyone who visits knows the truth. The man beneath it lived his entire adult life as a ghost wearing another man's name. The discovery of Klaus Steiner's escape and four-decade deception forces uncomfortable questions about justice, accountability, and the moral complexity of survival. Was he a deserter or a refugee? A man exercising legitimate self-preservation or someone evading rightful consequences? History offers no easy answers, only frameworks for thinking through difficult moral terrain. Klaus Steiner was not a war criminal in the conventional sense. Investigation into his service record reveals no evidence of participation in atrocities, no involvement in Holocaust implementation, no command over units that committed massacres. He was a border police officer who monitored smuggling and refugee movements, essentially a bureaucrat in uniform, enforcing regulations rather than perpetrating violence. But he served the Nazi regime. His work intercepting refugees fleeing Nazi persecution contributed to a system that murdered millions. The people he arrested trying to cross illegally into Switzerland or Italy were often Jews, political dissidents, or others fleeing for their lives. How many people who might have escaped died because Klaus Steiner did his job efficiently? Dr. Rebecca Steinman, the Holocaust historian attached to Operation Eichhaus, addresses this in her ethical analysis. Steiner occupies the vast gray zone of complicity. He wasn't Eichmann organizing deportations or Mengele conducting experiments, but neither was he an innocent bystander. He was a cog in the machinery, and the machinery's purpose was extermination. His hands weren't bloody, but they operated the gears. When he deserted, he wasn't fleeing accountability for crimes. He was fleeing a war that finally threatened him personally after he'd spent years enforcing its mechanisms on others. This distinction matters legally and morally. Post-war justice focused on specific criminal acts: murder, torture, direct participation in genocide. Millions of Germans served the Nazi regime in administrative capacities: police, clerks, bureaucrats, soldiers, whose individual actions weren't prosecutable but whose collective effort enabled atrocities. Steiner belonged to that vast population whose guilt was diffuse, structural, complicit rather than direct. Was Steiner's desertion morally justified? The question divides along philosophical lines. One perspective holds that soldiers who swear oaths and accept military discipline cannot simply abandon their posts when service becomes inconvenient or dangerous. By this logic, Steiner was a coward who failed his duty, fabricated his death to avoid consequences, and lived decades in unearned freedom while millions died. But another perspective argues that individuals have no obligation to sacrifice themselves for immoral regimes. By 1942, Nazi Germany was clearly perpetrating genocide. Steiner had lost his family to the war's consequences. Should he have obediently marched to his death in Russia to fulfill an oath sworn to a regime that destroyed everything he loved? Military ethics professor Dr. Hans Richter, consulted during the investigation, offers this analysis. Desertion in defense of tyranny is different from desertion in service to tyranny. If Steiner had deserted in 1939 to avoid participating in an unjust invasion, that would be morally defensible. Deserting in 1942, after 3 years of enforcing Nazi policies, to avoid personal danger, that's more complicated. He didn't desert from conscience. He deserted from self-interest after his complicity became personally costly. Steiner's own journal entry captures this complexity. "I will not die in Russian snow for a regime that couldn't protect my family from its own consequences." He frames desertion not as moral opposition but as transaction. The regime failed its implicit bargain, so he owes it nothing. This is pragmatism, not principle, survival rather than resistance. Should Steiner have faced justice? For what crimes, under which laws? His service as a border police officer was legal under German law at the time, enforcing border regulations, even regulations that prevented escape of persecuted populations, wasn't prosecutable under post-war international law unless specific criminal acts could be proven. Desertion was a military offense under German law, but victor nations rarely pursued deserters from defeated enemies. Desertion arguably reduced the enemy's fighting strength, benefiting the Allies. Yet there's a moral dimension beyond legality. Steiner lived 43 comfortable years in Argentina while millions who suffered under Nazi policies received no comparable second chance. The Jewish families he prevented from crossing borders, sent back to territories where many died, they received no new identities, no escape to South America, no second lives under Argentine sun. Holocaust survivor advocacy groups, when informed of the investigation's findings in 2025, issued statements emphasizing this disparity. Simon Wiesenthal Center Director Dr. Ephraim Zuroff stated, "Steiner wasn't Eichmann, but he served the same system. That he escaped accountability while living peacefully for decades is emblematic of how many Nazi-era perpetrators and collaborators evaded justice. It's not about punishing an old man. He's dead 39 years. It's about acknowledging that the system failed to account for thousands like him." Perhaps the most troubling aspect of Steiner's story is its connection to the Ratlins that later evacuated genuine war criminals. The infrastructure Steiner navigated in 1942, Swiss safe houses, French forgers, Spanish contacts, Argentine settlement, was the prototype for the networks that saved Eichmann, Mengele, Priebke, and hundreds of others responsible for industrialized murder. Steiner didn't build those networks intentionally for that purpose. He didn't assist Nazi fugitives, but his successful transit proved the routes worked, established contacts that would later be used, and demonstrated that elaborate false identities could withstand scrutiny. He was the test run for an escape system that would later be refined to evacuate monsters. Does this implicate him in their escapes? Philosophically, it raises questions about causal responsibility across time. If you pioneer a route that others use for evil purposes, are you partially responsible for their actions, even if you never intended that outcome? Father Louis Mercier wrestled with exactly this question in his letters to Steiner. He helped refugees in good conscience, assisted deserters like Steiner who seemed more victim than perpetrator, and in doing so built the infrastructure that Nazis later exploited. His theological agony centered on the doctrine of double effect. An action taken for good reasons can produce both good and evil outcomes, which consequences determine the action's moral character. Steiner's story exists within a historical context of thousands of similar escapes. The difference is that most were never discovered. Investigation estimates suggest 5,008 Wehrmacht deserters escaped to neutral countries or Allied lines during the war. Approximately 300-800 individuals directly responsible for Holocaust crimes escaped via Ratlins after 1945. Perhaps 3,500 additional Nazi Party members, SS officers, and collaborators escaped, most not individually responsible for specific atrocities, but complicit in the regime's functioning. Among those captured decades later, cases vary widely. Adolf Eichmann, architect of Holocaust logistics, captured 1960, executed 1962. Erich Priebke, SS officer responsible for massacre of 335 Italians, captured 1994, convicted, died under house arrest 2013. John Demjanjuk, Ukrainian guard at death camps, deported from US 2009, convicted 2011, died 2012 during appeal. These men were hunted for decades because their crimes were specific, documented, and egregious. Steiner was never hunted because his role was bureaucratic. his crimes diffuse, his culpability part of the vast apparatus rather than individually identifiable. Had he been discovered in 1950 or 1970, would he have faced prosecution? Probably not. Border police duty wasn't a prosecutable offense. Desertion, from the perspective of the German Federal Republic established in 1949, wasn't a crime worthy of pursuing across continents. He would have been an embarrassment, perhaps, a historical footnote, but not a target for justice. The investigation's discoveries create a troubling emotional complexity. It's difficult not to feel some empathy for Klaus Steiner, a man whose family was killed by Allied bombs, who faced near-certain death in Russia, who chose survival through ingenuity and courage. These are not the characteristics of a monster. His grief was real. His fear was justified. His planning and execution of escape demonstrate remarkable determination and skill. Yet empathy for individual suffering cannot erase structural complicity. Steiner's personal tragedy doesn't absolve his service to a genocidal regime. That he suffered doesn't mean he deserved escape when his victims couldn't escape. The fact that we can understand his motivations doesn't mean we should excuse his actions. This is the essential discomfort. History is populated not by simple villains and heroes, but by complicated people who made choices within constrained circumstances. Choices that had consequences they didn't intend or couldn't foresee. Choices that don't fit neatly into categories of right and wrong. The investigation's final report to German, Italian, and Argentine authorities includes a recommendation that Steiner's case be included in educational materials about the Nazi era, not as an example of villainy, but as an example of complicity's many forms. His story illustrates how ordinary people became integrated into extraordinary evil, how personal suffering coexisted with structural guilt, how escape from consequences was possible for some while impossible for others. Dr. Steinman's conclusion in the report reads, Klaus Steiner was neither a war criminal nor an innocent victim. He was a man who served an evil regime in a minor capacity, suffered personal tragedy, and chose survival over accountability. His escape doesn't demand retroactive prosecution. He's dead nearly 40 years, and the time for justice passed long ago. But his story demands recognition as part of the historical record, a reminder that the Nazi apparatus consisted not only of ideological fanatics and sadistic perpetrators, but also of bureaucrats and functionaries who did their jobs, suffered their own losses, and when given the chance, slipped away to build new lives while the world they helped break continued to bleed. The family Steiner turned back at the border, the refugees he arrested, the people who might have survived if he'd been less efficient at his job, they didn't get new identities or passage to Argentina. Their graves, when they have graves at all, mark the end of lives that received no second chances. Steiner got his second chance. Whether he deserved it is a question history can ask but probably never answer. August 2025. Grenzposten Alpha 7 stands open to the air for the first time since March 1942, preserved now as a historical site under joint Italian-German administration. The autonomous province of Bolzano, working with the German Federal Archives, has stabilized the structure, installed protective barriers to prevent ice damage, and created an interpretive center 500 meters downslope. The bunker itself remains largely unchanged from the day Klaus Steiner sealed it behind him. The maps still mark the Swiss border. The filing cabinet still holds personnel rosters. The leather satchel with his journal rests in climate-controlled storage in Berlin, but a facsimile lies on the desk where he wrote his final entry. The rifle that caught Dr. Marchetti's boot in August 2024 leans against the wall, exactly where Steiner left it. A plaque outside reads in German, Italian, and English, Grenzposten Alpha 7, border checkpoint operated 1941-942, site of the disappearance of Hauptmann Klaus Hermann Steiner, March 14, 1942, discovered August 2024. Preserved as a reminder that history leaves traces even when humans try to erase them. The site opened to visitors in May 2025. It's not a popular destination. The altitude and remoteness limit traffic to serious hikers and history enthusiasts. But those who make the climb encounter something rare. Physical space where a historical mystery lived, where a man made a choice that would define the rest of his life, where the border between survival and desertion, between victim and perpetrator, between Klaus Steiner and Giorgio Colombo, became permanently blurred. Dr. Marchetti, the climate researcher whose boot found the rifle, visits the site during the opening ceremony. She tells reporters, "I was documenting ice melt caused by climate change. I found a man's entire secret frozen in that ice. In a way, it's fitting, the warming world exposing what the cold preserved. How many other secrets are locked in glaciers we haven't explored? How many other lives are hidden in ice that hasn't melted yet?" It's a question that haunts the investigation team. If one obscure border checkpoint contained evidence that rewrote one man's history, what else is waiting? The Alps alone hold hundreds of military sites from both world wars, many abandoned and forgotten, buried under ice that's now disappearing. Each could contain evidence of other escapes, other fabricated deaths, other men and women who stepped out of history and into fabricated identities. In Argentina, Clara Colombo de Santos struggles with her family's revised history. In interviews after the investigation concluded, she describes the disorienting experience of learning her father was someone else entirely. "I grieved him in 1985 as Giorgio Colombo, my father. Now I'm grieving him again as Klaus Steiner, a man I never met. And I'm grieving for Anna, Helene, and Friedrich, my father's first family, who I didn't know existed, who are somehow part of my history now. How do you mourn people who died before you were born? How do you reconcile loving a father who was living a lie?" She's chosen to keep the name Colombo. It's the name she's carried for 67 years, the identity under which she built her own life. But she's also placed a memorial plaque at her father's grave with both names. Giorgio Colombo, 1907-1985, born Klaus Hermann Steiner, a man who survived by becoming someone else. May he find peace with whoever he truly was. The gravestone itself remains unchanged. Giorgio Colombo, beloved husband and father, Clara explains. That's who he was to us. That's the relationship we had. The fact it was built on a lie doesn't erase the 43 years he was our father. Truth is important, but love was real even when identity wasn't. In Germany, the discovery has prompted renewed examination of military records, searching for other fabricated deaths that might mask desertions. The Wehrmacht Casualty Office documented approximately 3.5 million German military deaths during World War II. How many were genuine? How many were administrative conveniences, covering for men who slipped away? The investigation team estimates perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 deaths that were actually successful escapes, a fraction of a percent, but still thousands of false graves and memorial inscriptions honoring men who lived decades under other names. Some historians argue these escapes should be celebrated as resistance to tyranny. Others insist they represent dereliction of duty and evasion of accountability. Most acknowledge the truth lies somewhere between, that each case was individual, motivated by unique circumstances, and not easily categorized. What remains unarguable is that the infrastructure for these escapes, whether used by innocent deserters like Steiner or genuine war criminals like Eichmann, represented a massive failure of post-war justice. That hundreds or thousands of people could vanish into false identities, live entire lives undetected, and die peacefully without accountability suggests the systems established to enforce consequences for Nazi-era crimes were fundamentally inadequate. The investigation's final report, published in March 2025, concludes with a reflection that resonates beyond Steiner's individual case. We have documented one man's escape from history. We have traced his path from the Alps to Argentina, from Hauptmann to Surveyor, from Klaus to Giorgio. We have proven that he lived 43 years under a lie so complete that even his children never suspected. And we are forced to ask, How many others did the same? How many other men in other countries lived and died as someone else, their true identity sealed as thoroughly as that alpine bunker, their secrets preserved until time or chance revealed them? The answer is we will never know. Most such secrets die with their keepers. Ice melts, but paper burns. Witnesses forget. Evidence disappears. For every Klaus Steiner we discover, there are likely dozens we never will. They lived, they died, they were buried under false names, and their truth is lost to history. As autumn approaches the Ortler Massif in 2025, the first snows begin dusting the peaks. The checkpoint at 2,847 meters will soon be inaccessible again until next spring, sealed by winter much as it was sealed by Klaus Steiner in 1942, much as the truth was sealed inside Giorgio Colombo for 43 years. Standing inside the bunker in late September 2025, Chief Inspector Hoffman reflects on the investigation's meaning. This place is a monument to human complexity. A man stood here, mourning his dead family, facing his own probable death, and made a choice. Was it cowardice? Was it courage? Was it both? I don't know. History will argue. But what I know is this: Klaus Steiner sealed this checkpoint thinking he was erasing himself from history. Instead, he preserved the evidence that would one day reveal the truth. He thought he could become someone else entirely. But you cannot escape yourself, even across an ocean, even across a lifetime. Eventually, the ice melts. Eventually, the truth emerges. The wind howls across the mountain ridge much as it did on March 14, 1942, when Klaus Steiner walked out into the storm and disappeared. The difference is that now we know where he went, how he got there, and who he became. The mystery is solved. But the deeper mystery, what it means that he succeeded, what it means that thousands like him succeeded, what it means that justice failed for victims while escape succeeded for perpetrators, that mystery remains. It's not a mystery of facts but of meaning, not of what happened but of what it reveals about human nature, about systems of accountability, about the relationship between individual choice and historical consequence. The mountains keep secrets for decades, even centuries. Glaciers preserve what humans try to destroy. And sometimes, when climate changes and ice retreats, the past emerges into the present, carrying with it questions we thought were settled and truths we never suspected. Klaus Hermann Steiner vanished from history in March 1942. Giorgio Colombo lived comfortably in Buenos Aires until August 1985. Both men were the same person. Both lives were real. And now, 83 years after a German border officer walked away from his post into a blizzard, we finally know what happened to him. He survived. That is the simple, undeniable truth. Whether he should have, whether justice demanded otherwise, whether morality required he face consequences for his service to a genocidal regime, whether his personal suffering earned him the right to escape, these questions have no final answers. History can document, it can reveal, it can reconstruct, but it cannot judge with finality. That judgment, if it exists anywhere, lies somewhere beyond the reach of investigation, beyond the evidence preserved in frozen bunkers or archived in deposit boxes, beyond the testimonies of granddaughters who never knew their grandfather's real name. Klaus Steiner walked into the mountains in 1942. Giorgio Colombo walked out of them into a new life, and the earth kept his secret for 83 years. How many other secrets still wait beneath the ice?